Here we go. We're starting in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, looking at this text on eldership. So we'll start by reading the text here. And it says in the NIV translation, "Here is a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. And he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap." All right, so this is that text that our elders looked at last week. This is what they referenced in answer to the question, what makes someone qualified to serve as an elder for this church, or really for any church? So we're going to walk through these texts. We looked at that. And as we talk about eldership, I want to define a few terms. And we're going to come back to the text that I just read, but let's zoom out for just a moment, zoom out through the rest of the New Testament and look at some terms that are used in Scripture to talk about the term that we might use for this term elder. The New Testament has three different words that are used. The first word, overseer, sometimes it's translated overseer, and the Greek word there is episkopos. You might have some neighbors that are Episcopalian, but that church, the Episcopalian church, gets its name from this word. It's a church that is led by overseers. Sometimes this word episkopos by some tribes of Christians might be translated as bishop. And they try to make bishop a different level from elder at times, but we'll come back to that idea. The next word there is translated as elder, presbyteros, and you might have some Presbyterian neighbors. Presbyterians, they get their name for their denomination from this Greek word presbyteros. This is the word that kind of like our English word elder, you can switch it from elder to make it at an adverb ending, make it ly, elderly. And suddenly it's no longer talking about an office. It's just an adjective describing someone who is up in years, an older person. It's just like that in the Greek word. The Greek word can mean an older person. But when it's describing it in this context, the word elder could mean someone who is just older, or it could be someone who is appointed to a role or an office of leadership and service in the church. So that word is used in both kinds of contexts. And then a third word that is used, shepherd, poimen. And this word is used in a figurative sense at different places in the New Testament. The figurative sense is someone who does shepherding. We say from Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Jesus in John chapter 10 says, I am the good shepherd. And there's many instructions to leaders of the flock to act as shepherds to their flock. So that flock is within the same vocabulary metaphor as shepherd. And we're all sheep in that sense, kind of tying back into the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So those who lead the sheep are the shepherds, but obviously that's a figurative idea, but we'll come back to that. So let's look at these texts, because here's our big question. Are these three different roles of church leadership? Or are they three different words used to describe a single role of church leadership? So as we look at these texts, here's some key texts that we can look at. Acts chapter 20, this is Paul as he is saying goodbye to the church in Ephesus. From Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus, and he sent for the elders there. That's verse 17. and then jump ahead to verse 28. And he gives them the instruction, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood. And just in case you can't see it really clearly in the English, you can see it even more clearly in the Greek, but I gave the highlight color coding there. There it is. Verse 17 uses the word elders, presbyteros. Verse 28 says the Spirit has made you overseers. That's the noun episkopos. And then the verb be shepherds, act like shepherds, poimen of God. Right there in that one context, all three words are used to describe the exact same group of men who are leading the church in Ephesus. All right. After that, we can bring up Philippians chapter 1. Paul and Timothy, they're servants of Christ Jesus to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. Interesting that as Paul talks to the Philippian church, he uses overseers, that's the word episkopos, and deacons, diakonoi, diakonos in the singular. So he doesn't say elders and deacons, he says overseers and deacons. Why does he use the word overseer and not the word elder? In the passage that we began reading in 1 Timothy chapter 3, it says, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. He uses that word overseer there, but later he will use the word elder as we keep going down the passage. All right, so that's how that's used in 1 Timothy and Philippians. If we switch over to the book of Titus, a letter that Paul is writing to Titus, very, very similar to the way in which he's writing the letter of 1 Timothy to Timothy. Just like Timothy has a job to grow and establish churches that were planted by him and Paul, Timothy's doing that over in Ephesus. Well, Titus is doing the same kind of work over on the island of Crete. He and Paul had planted these churches. Paul moved on and Titus is left behind. And part of Titus's job is to appoint elders in these churches. These are very, very young churches, first generation church. This church has only been established a year or two, maybe less. And versus over in Ephesus, where that church had been there for nearly a generation at the time that Paul is writing to the first Timothy. So in Titus, the reason that I, Paul, left you, Titus, in Crete was so that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders, presbyteros, in every town as I directed you. An elder, presbyteros, must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless. Overseer, episkopos. He must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, and not pursuing dishonest gain. Here in the same context, Paul switches between elder and overseer. In that context, he's not talking about two different offices. He's talking about the same role, and he's using two words interchangeably. Then we can see not only is this the vocabulary that Paul uses as recorded by Luke in Acts, as recorded by Paul in his letters to the Philippians, to 1 Timothy, and to Titus, but now let's bring in a new author, Peter. This is what Peter says. Peter, to the elders among you. Peter is writing to churches in Central Asia Minor, that's central Turkey today, might be similar to where the letter to the Galatian church was written by Paul. To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder. Timothy or Peter sees himself as an elder and a witness of Christ's suffering, who will also share in the glory to be revealed. Elders, here's your job. Get ready. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. Shepherds is the verb for what it says, be shepherds. We don't usually, we sometimes might say, what is the shepherd doing? He's shepherding his sheep. There's shepherding turned into a verb. This is actually the verb in Greek, shepherd. God's flock, or be shepherds to God's flock. And then switching over to after the comma, watching over them, and you'll notice that's highlighted in yellow, because the word watching over is the verb form, or the participle form, of overseer, episkopos. It's that root word is there, overseeing them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. There's another shepherding word. Lording, not lording, is kind of the opposite of overseeing. In verse 4, when the chief shepherd, talking about Jesus, he's the chief shepherd, he's the boss of the junior shepherds that are these elders of the churches. The chief shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of glory that will never fade away. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. And there's a contrast in age between younger and elder, but it's still in that context of not just generally someone who is older, although we are talking about generally people who are younger, but it's in this larger context when we say elder, not just generally someone who is older, although they're still worthy of respect and we should be submissive to them in deference and respect, but to these guys who are serving in the role and the function of the church as elders, be submissive to them. All of you, and that's all of y'all, elders, young folks, old folks, young folks, men, women, everyone, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but he shows grace to the humble. If we take those passages right there and kind of draw some conclusions between those three words, overseer, elder, and shepherd, you'll know, I conclude that they are synonymous in the New Testament. They're used interchangeably. The difference between them, why are the different words used? Because each term focuses on a different aspect of the same role. And here's what the different aspects are. That word episkopos, it is used more often in a Gentile context, because it's not just the church that has episkopos, episkopoi in the plural. It's not just the church that has episkopoi. A Greek city would have overseers. So we're taking the word of overseer leader that would be used in a civic context for a Greek city, and we're talking about the overseer leader now here in the church. So to folks who think in Greek culture, he uses the word that would be appropriate for Greek culture. But the word presbyteros, elder, that's the word that is used for the Jewish people who speak Greek and are leaders of synagogues. If you remember, Jesus was arrested or persecuted by the chief priest and the elders of the people. Elders of what? Well, those are leaders of Jewish synagogues. So just like the synagogue had leaders who were overseeing in the synagogue, just like that, now that we are in the church, we're going to have overseers. So he borrows the word from the Jewish synagogue context. Presbyteros is borrowed from Jewish synagogue context. Overseer, episkopos, is borrowed from the Greek city context. And then shepherd is a word that is really the word that is used most throughout the Old Testament, going back to Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. But even in the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah both had scathing rebukes of the Jewish leaders because they were bad shepherds of God's people. So there's going to be a good shepherd instead of the bad shepherds. So a shepherd is the word that is used from the Old Testament, not only looking at Jeremiah, Isaiah, Psalm 23, but looking at who are the best leaders of God's people. David, what was his job before he became king? He's a shepherd. Moses, what was his job before he became the leader of Israel? Spent 40 years in Midian as a shepherd. So the best leaders of God's people have been shepherds of literal sheep, but then they became shepherds of the flock of God's people. So these are just different words that all have the exact same meaning, and they're used in different contexts, but they mean to lead and take care of, oversee God's people. So if you have ever been a part of an Episcopal church, or maybe have friends or neighbors that are a part of Episcopal church, and not only Episcopal, but also within the Roman Catholic Church, they have this other word, bishop. And whenever they use the word bishop in English, they are referring to episkopos as the word behind it. And they mean within the Catholic Church, within the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church, they mean by that another layer of leadership. Where did that come from? It came from an early church father named Ignatius. And Ignatius wrote several letters, and the church was already taking structure at that point, so that you might have the elders over the church in Meridian. Then you got a church up in Eagle, and you've got some elders over a church in that, and a church down in Cunin, a church over in Boise, and one over in Nampa, and one in Caldwell, and they've got their own elders over their local churches. But in order to network them together and provide oversight, who's going to hold those different groups of elders accountable will have a higher level of administrative authority that's overseeing those. And Ignatius uses the word episkopos, and it's translated as bishop. And then based on that principle, already at work in the 2nd century, the Catholic Church begins to create administrative districts that 100% mirror the administrative districts of the Roman Empire. And you end up with archbishops. Arch is the Greek word for chief, like an arch enemy or an archangel, but an archbishop is the chief bishop. And the administrative districts of the Roman Church in like the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries just pretty well parallel the administrative districts of the Roman Empire. And so if you are the archbishop of an administrative district, you have a cathedral. And that's what separates a cathedral from a normal church building. A cathedral goes back to a Greek word that means the chair, or where the bishop sits. So that's where the word cathedral comes from, and it ties into that. So that did creep into the fairly early church. We're talking a few generations away from the New Testament. Is it bad? Not necessarily. Is it God ordained? Not necessarily. So it's a way of structuring leadership using the principles that they had, but it's not exactly the form of leadership structure that we see in the New Testament. And in our practice in our church and other Christian churches, we have local elders that oversee our church, and our neighboring churches have local elders that oversee those churches. And we might be loosely connected through a network. Bible colleges help facilitate that network, but also church camps, mission organizations, and other resources, publishing houses, things like that help to kind of tie the network together. But there's not a lot of direct oversight within the way that we structure. That does parallel, I think, the closest of what we see in the New Testament. There is another structure between the episcopal role that has the very high structured hierarchy that goes up and down the chain that we see today in the Roman Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church, and on our end, the localized elders that might have some networking connections, but not a lot of strong ties to each other. In between is a Presbyterian model that would have local congregations with local elders, but then out of each of those local elders, they would send one or two of those elders to a higher up group called a presbytery. And the presbytery would kind of do some governmental or administrative oversight over a group of churches that are kind of tied together, networked together in a region. The churches that do that would point to Acts chapter 15 as a model for that. And in Acts chapter 15, we see they're talking about whether or not they're going to include Gentiles in the church. So they call a church council, and the apostles decide that that they're going to allow Gentiles into the church, and they have a couple stipulations, but they meet together like that. There's a neat principle at work there, but also point out that there's a few issues that we can't replicate. We don't have apostles today that can come together and make the decision for the church. We just don't have apostles today. I do appreciate the principle of interdependence there, and I think that that's a valuable principle. And truthfully, I mean, it might even get me in trouble to slightly to say this, but I think that we could do a better job of having a greater level of interdependence and oversight among our churches. But we also want to guard against the really overstructured hierarchy. But I think that drawing from biblical principles, we can see independence as well as interdependence as the model of what's happening in the New Testament. Any questions on that? Clear as mud. All right. Okay. It's interesting. Yeah, Diane.
Curious if you can address where lay ministry falls in.
Lay ministry. Good question about lay ministry. We can, that's actually going to come up in our study of 1 Timothy when we get down the road in chapter 5 and 6. So I'm going to come, if we want to just hold on to that, we'll come back to it there. But Doug or Gail had a question. I did it again. That's just my instinct. If I think about it, I know it's Debbie. Mrs. Debbie Graff. Right. So to just kind of sweep the floor with some big picture denominations, the big three structure ideas that I just kind of outlined, to hang them in space here, we'll put the Episcopal model, which is very hierarchical, and in the middle we'll put the Presbyterian model that has more interdependence, not quite as much hierarchy, and then on the far end would be the local elder model. Our tribe, Christian churches, are normally more like that. We have some cousins, the disciples of Christ, that are a bit more in that middle Presbyterian. They have a modified version of that. And I hope that I guess I shouldn't let it go without saying, I might assume that you understand that within each of these three major models, there are numerous variations between each of these three models. So I'm speaking with very broad strokes. So our disciples of Christ, cousins, they follow more of that Presbyterian model. The Presbyterian churches follow more of that Presbyterian model. Most Baptist churches follow more of that middle Presbyterian model. On the far right, the Episcopalian model, that's very structured and hierarchical. You're going to find Roman Catholics, the United Methodist Church, Episcopal Church, and the Mormon Church followed that model for their structure. On the far, I said Roman Catholics over here. Yeah. That's okay. Bless you. And on that far right side, let's see. Independent churches of lots of different tribes are more like that. Independent Christian churches, that's kind of why we're called independent Christian churches. Churches of Christ are very much that way. Our non-instrumental cousins are very much that way. So that's kind of a broad stroke. I don't know if you have any specific group in mind, Debbie, that you're wondering where they might line up, but those are three general models. And again, there's numerous variations between each of those three general models, and you'll find that each denomination will have its own tweaks because it just works better for them. Yeah, great question. All right. Okay, we'll move on here and talk about Now we're going to get into this actual text. And I want to point out a part of the structure. If you go back up and look at what we were reading in 1 Timothy 3, you might have noticed the word must appears several times. It starts in verse 2, the elder must be above reproach. Then in verse 4, the elder must manage his own family well. And then down in verse 6, he must not be a recent convert. And then in verse 7, he must have a good reputation with outsiders. And the NIV translators I can see what they're doing. Sometimes the Greek word must is there. And sometimes the Greek word must is not there, but the grammar is clear in the Greek that's tying back to the previous must. And so there's little grammatical markers in the Greek that lets us know that we're making us the next parallel comment that is on the same level of command as the previous comment. So that's where these 4 musts come through. But as we look at this text, if you were to kind of structure it or try to draw out the way that Paul is structuring his thoughts, I think that these 4 musts kind of provide the structural outline for Paul's thoughts. So above reproach, what does that mean? He'll unpack that. Manage his own family well. What does that mean? He'll unpack that. Not be a recent convert. Why? Let's unpack that. And then finally, a good reputation with outsiders. And then he unpacks that thought. So these would be the 4 bullet points that would be in the far left side of his page. And then the rest of his thoughts might be bulleted, but they would be indented below each of these points. If you're a person that likes a good outline, like I do, I'm known for outlining. My students usually appreciate my outlines. When I asked Julie to be my girlfriend, I brought a 5-point outline on a Post-it note. But I didn't forget a point. And it worked. I didn't have a pocket protector, no. But I had a Post-it note with 5-point outlines and 5-point outline and 3 laps around the soccer field. We sealed the deal. That's good. All right. Here's a trustworthy saying. The text begin that we've already read, but verse 1 of chapter 3 says, here's a trustworthy saying. And the question about that little phrase is the trustworthy saying what's about to come here in chapter 3, or is the trustworthy saying what was just said previously at the end of chapter 2? And you might say, well, obviously it's chapter 3 because of the chapter break. But then we would have to remind ourselves that no, not so obviously, because those chapters were not added until 1,000 years later. So Paul and Timothy never saw the chapter breaks or the verse the divisions that you and I look at. Paul and Timothy never saw that. They had no idea that someone came along later and added these chapter and verse breaks. Now, I lean toward the trustworthy saying where it says, this is a trustworthy saying. I lean that toward the trustworthy saying being the previous verse, which was the end of chapter 2, because it talked about women in salvation. The reason I lean that direction is because that little phrase, trustworthy saying, appears 5 times between 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. And in the 5 times that trustworthy saying appears, 4 of them clearly use the word salvation as a noun or a verb. And whoever aspires to be a noble, to be an overseer, desires a noble task, doesn't have the word salvation, but the word salvation is in the last verse of chapter 2. So I think it kind of points backwards. That's where I lean. If I get to heaven and find out I'm wrong, I'll be okay. It won't disappoint me too much because I can see why the guy who broke up the verses and the chapters made the decision, because whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Well, that sounds like an awfully trustworthy saying too. So it's not like it's wrong. It's not like it's not a trustworthy saying. It's just I don't think that it's parallel to the other 4 trustworthy sayings. That's what I'm saying. All right. So here's the phrase: whoever desires to be an overseer and an episkopos desires a noble task. And that phrase "noble task" it could be translated with the same words to say a good work. And then here we go. We're going to unpack that. Number one. Here's the qualifications: must be above reproach. And that idea of must, it's pretty well a requirement. And what does above reproach mean? A couple of things that above reproach means. Number one, above reproach is the umbrella under which the next list of qualities is going to fall under that umbrella. When we get to next week, we'll talk about deacons. And guess what? There's an umbrella term for deacons. You can open up 1 Timothy chapter 3 and go down to verse 8 and following, and you'll see an umbrella word for deacons. This is above reproach is the umbrella word for elders. So it's an umbrella word that all these other qualities are kind of helping to define what above reproach means. But it also talks, I think, it speaks toward intentionality about developing elders. Some of us in the room asked a really great question of our elders last week about, do we have a pipeline? Are we developing future elders? And they have had that in the past. At the moment, the pipeline is kind of turned off, but a lot of that is not so much because they wanted to turn the pipeline off, but more because they wanted to establish a little bit more continuity and a little more stability, because we've had a lot of changes recently with Pastor Steve retiring and eldership standing on its own feet without Pastor Steve contributing in that role. And what does it look like as they develop Henry? So I think if you were to ask them, they would say that their goal is to turn the pipeline back on sometime when it is necessary down the road. So above reproach, as we define that, keep in mind that above reproach does not mean flawless or sinless. We're not talking about perfection, but we're talking about there's not a glaring, obvious reason why this person should not be considered a leader or an example in God's people. If there's a glaring, obvious reason, then we need to have a conversation about what above reproach means. I've been in some churches where there were some elders who were not above reproach. I'm not going to go into many details past that. I'd be happy to talk about details in private conversation, but not here. And then in English, Greek doesn't have a colon as a punctuation mark, but in English, we would probably use the punctuation mark, a colon here, because the following terms are going to help us define what above reproach means. So starting off, faithful to his wife. Literally, the Greek phrase is a one-woman man. Mios is feminine for one. Gunaikos is woman, and andra, man. He's a one-woman man. Now, the question is, what does one-woman man mean? Because there's been a lot of different interpretations over that. Can you think of some possibilities? They might be on your handout. But can you think of some possibilities on what one-woman man might possibly mean, or what would disqualify someone? Polygamy. If you're practicing polygamy, you are not a one-woman man. Is that what they had in mind? Is that what Paul is warning Timothy about? Probably not. Polygamy was very rarely practiced in the Roman Empire. Polygamy was rarely practiced among the Jews, although you could be a lawbreaker if you're not a polygamous man at times. Under what circumstance would you be breaking the law if you're not polygamous? Under this specific circumstance, it's called levirate marriage. I don't have any brothers, but say I did, and say my brother died. I really hope that he married a good woman, because if I'm an ancient Jew, it would be my job, according to the Levitical law, to take his wife as my own, and on his behalf, beget a child for him. And the reason for that is that allows his line to continue to have the inheritance, and it provides the inheritance for my brother's widow. So if a person did not do that, they were a lawbreaker. And there was a specific person in the Old Testament, actually a couple of them, one of them named Onan. There's a little phrase, I think the King James said he spilled his seed upon the ground. And there's a lot of questions about what that means, but there's actually a very clear answer. It means that he was enjoying his personal benefits of his brother's widow, but it was not actually trying to provide for her. Bad move, guy. So don't be like Onan. There was another story where Judah had a son who died, and his son's wife Tamar should be getting a brother, but Judah wasn't giving a brother to Tamar. So Tamar dressed up like a prostitute, ended up with Judah, keeps his staff and seal as evidence, as collateral. And then when Tamar comes up pregnant, Judah says, "How dare you, you hussy?" And Tamar says, "Well, my baby daddy owns these." And Judah recognizes that he is less righteous than she. And don't be like Judah. So those are a few examples where in the Old Testament, that's the only circumstance under which polygamy is really advocated, recommended, and committing the law if you're not committing a break of the law if you're not practicing that. Otherwise, it's never encouraged. And you'll notice every single story of polygamy in the Old Testament does not end well. There is way more drama in those stories than there needs to be. And the polygamous arrangement is usually one of the sources of the drama. But polygamy is probably not what the specific instance that Paul has in mind. Another possibility, could he be thinking about divorce or remarriage? Maybe an elder is not allowed to be divorced. Is that what's going on in this phrase? And there are some churches who will not ever allow a person to commit who has been divorced to ever be an elder. Just pause on that for a second. Did you know that most likely Paul was divorced? There's not direct evidence for that in Scripture. However, remember that Paul was a Pharisee. Being married is a requirement to be a Pharisee. So what happened to his wife? It could be that his wife maybe passed away. Could be. We don't know. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul describes and says, if you are a widower, or if you're unmarried, I advise you to stay unmarried like I am. And the like I am, I don't think applies only to the fact that like I am not married, but like I am not married currently as opposed to how I used to be. I think there's an illusion there that Paul had been previously married. It's not a hill that I'm willing to die on, but I think that the evidence is fairly strong. Now, there are, again, I've been to some churches who treat divorce as if it is a felony on someone's Christian record that can never be expunged. And I want to pause on that topic for a moment, just because if Paul was a murderer and can become an apostle, if Paul was maybe divorced and can become an apostle, and those events happened in his BC days, his before Christ days, before he met Jesus. I don't see Jesus taking the sins that we have committed beforehand and using those to prevent us from what we can do in the kingdom. I just don't see that pattern in Scripture. So that's why divorce flatly, as just a flat principle, I want to say I don't think it applies in that way. Now, some divorces, tell me the details of the divorce. It just might involve shepherding. Because shepherding, you can't be a good shepherd if you don't smell like sheep. It just might involve getting down into kind of the nitty gritty. Okay, what happened? Are we talking about a divorce where the former wife, maybe the divorce happened before the guy ever came to Jesus. And now that he's come to Jesus, he lives a totally different life. That's a different issue. Maybe we're talking about a divorce where the wife gave him one of the reasons for legitimate divorce. In the New Testament, it lists both a sexual immorality. This is in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5. And in that passage I just referenced, in that context of 1 Corinthians 7, abandonment. Could it be that a guy his wife abandoned him, or that she had committed some kind of sexual immorality, maybe adultery or something like that, and that was the reason for the divorce, a legitimate reason for divorce within Scripture? Could it be that kind of issue? And maybe the guy didn't want the divorce, but she found another guy and she wants to stay with him and not with her first husband. And later down the line, maybe God's calling that guy to be an elder. Is that going to keep him from that? I would say, let's give it some time and let's see what the track record is. Let's see the character. But I wouldn't hold that as just a flat reason not to. But again, this is me speaking. This is Vance speaking, not me speaking on behalf of the church or on behalf of all Christendom. Could it mean that if he had been divorced, they could never remarry again? And there's a lot of confusion about remarriage, especially in those divorce passages in Matthew 19 and in Matthew 5. In those contexts, they're looking at a passage in Deuteronomy that permitted divorce, and Jesus is rebuking Pharisees for acting like they're righteous because they filled out paperwork. Because Deuteronomy 24 says you must give her a certificate of divorce. And so the Pharisee is saying, here's your paperwork. Aren't I righteous? Next. And he's already got the next wife lined up. And what Jesus is saying is, if you think you're righteous because you filled out the paperwork and you've already got your next wife picked out, no, you're still an adulterer. You're just an adulterer that filled out paperwork. That's the point of what he's saying there. So big picture, I think the better way to translate this is just the way that the NIV translated it: faithful to his wife. And that faithfulness to his wife, there needs to be a track record of that. Years of faithfulness. Probably not a newly married person. Someone who has a track record of faithfulness. In fact, today, my in-laws, Bruce and Chris Miller in Omaha, Nebraska, are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary today. So that's a pretty cool thing on my wife's side of the family. That's a lot of faithfulness. He's served in the past as a deacon at his church. So what about a man who had been divorced when he was a Christian for legitimate reasons for divorce, but now he's in a healthy, faithful marriage? That's kind of the situation that we were just talking about a moment ago. If it comes down to, I usually have students that says, well, what about the guy who it wasn't a good reason for a divorce and he was just as responsible for the divorce as she was? Maybe he's the one that committed adultery, but now he's with his new wife and it's been 10 years and now is he eligible? And different churches are going to make different judgments on that. That's a situation that I'm not comfortable with. I would not be comfortable with that situation. And to that, I would say a person in that situation has a lot of opportunity to serve the kingdom of God outside of elder. Keep serving the kingdom of God. That doesn't mean you have to be an elder. That would be my answer to that. So just keep serving. Let's move on from this, and we, in our remaining time, go through the rest of this list. The overseers to be above reproach. And then here's how we're going to define that. Not only faithful to his wife, but also he's temperate. He's not rash. He's not emotional. He's not known for being emotional. He doesn't shoot from the hip. He's clear thinking. He's rational. He's self-controlled. That's one of the fruit of the Spirit. And self-controlled is a word that's going to come up. It's going to be, the deacons are going to be self-controlled. We're going to get to older men and older women down the line later in the book, and they'll need to be self-controlled. It's a fruit of the Spirit. He's respectable, and that will be used to describe the women of the church. Actually, earlier in chapter 2, the women are to be respectable. And as opposed to wearing fancy jewelry and braided hair and gold and pearls and all that stuff. Next, the elder needs to be hospitable. He's willing to give of himself for others out of his own home in some kind of way, and then able to teach. Contrast this to that prohibition earlier back last week in chapter 2, verse 12, talking about the women. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority. And I think that this focus on teaching is that the teaching that was prohibited for women back in chapter 2, we talked about this last week, or you can watch the other video, was authoritative teaching, like teaching in the role of the elder, defining the core doctrines of the church, not necessarily teaching something beyond something else, not the core doctrines, but not even maybe even teaching core doctrines, but not defining them. Teaching practical living, even teaching through books of the Bible. So what does teaching look like? Looks like articulation, explanation, defense of the doctrines that we believe as a church. When our elders were here last week and they were interviewed, 95% of what they told you, I could have told you myself, because I've talked with them. I knew the answers to that, but it's way better for you to hear it from them than to hear it from me. That was one thing I knew. But that 5% that I didn't know that they have a 21-point questionnaire on doctrine before they invite someone to be an elder. I didn't know that. So that's the importance of teaching and doctrinal awareness. Continuing on, not given to drunkenness. So you can say alcoholism, by extension, drug abuse. It shows a lack of respectability, a lack of self-control, a lack of being sober-minded. So not given to drunkenness is an important factor there. I didn't delete my Greek word up at the top of that slide, day. That's the word for he must. Next qualities. Not violent, but gentle. Can you imagine having an elder that gets in fistfights? That's not a healthy environment. Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. Violence is not the way for God's people to solve their problems. Not quarrelsome. Remember back in chapter 2, the men were supposed to lift up holy hands without anger, without disputing. So if this guy is an elder, he needs to be not quarrelsome and not a lover of money. He's an example of responsible stewardship, an example of generosity, and our guys talked about that as a requirement. And then next, he must manage his own family well. Does this mean an elder must be married? What do you think? If he's not married, is he disqualified? Elaine has a good thought.
No, she doesn't.
I can see the wheels turning.
Asked me to back that up.
Okay.
Because well, I almost want to say family can be, but it can't really be defined a whole lot of different ways.
Okay.
But it's maybe those closest around you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So managing his own family well. In many ways, being in a family and leading a family well says a lot about how well and how skilled you would be to lead God's family. And relating to older people, relating to brothers and sisters, peers, relating to younger people as kids. And there's a lot of experience in being a good leader in your own family that will help you be a better leader in God's family. At the same time, just pause for this. I've seen, again, some churches that would say, if he's not married, he can't be an elder. My response to that was, so Jesus couldn't be an elder in your church? Paul couldn't be an elder in your church? There are some wonderful godly people who are called to singleness that might meet the rest of these criteria, might meet some of the best qualified people, not because they're anti-family, but because they're just not called to be married. I would not, in my opinion, I would not want to prohibit such a person, withhold eldership from a person that's qualified in every other possible way. And the same thing when we move into children, see that his children obey him. And again, that's one of those that involves a lot of shepherding. We have to get into the nitty gritty. Sometimes I know one guy back in my hometown. His kids were my age. I was the same age as his second son. He had 5 kids. 4 of them are amazing. Wonderful, graduated on the honor roll. 4 of them went to college, had great jobs, great families. One of them was an addict. Is he a bad father? And in fact, the way that he continued to love his addicted son let me know how much of a good father he was. So that child didn't obey him, but you could tell why. But it involves shepherding, it involves really getting to know. Now, if we're talking about a person who neglects his kids, who doesn't know how many kids he has, who never sees his kids, never talks to his kids, who won't financially support his kids in any way, yeah, we're talking about someone who's not qualified to be an elder. And we mentioned among the elders currently serving in our church, one of them has no kids. Not that they didn't want to, but that just wasn't God's will for their family. Also, among the elders that we have more than one who has been divorced. And you can ask them their personal stories if you want to. It's not my job to explain that. Last quality on this slide, he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. The kids respect him. There's a loving relationship that he has with his kids. Continuing on, under the heading of he must manage his own family well, here's a caveat. Because if he doesn't know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? If he is just a dumpster fire of broken relationships, you don't want that guy as an elder. So there's major parallels between leading in God's household and leading in our household. Continuing on in verse 6, not a recent convert. This is not someone that we just baptized a year or two ago, but he has a track record. If he's a recent convert, there's a danger he could become conceited. It's interesting that qualification, not a recent convert, is not on the list of qualities when Paul is giving instructions to Titus over in Crete. Why? Because in Crete, everyone's a recent convert. It's a brand new planted church. Last quality here, they might fall under the same judgment as the devil, that judgment of pride, the sin of pride. Verse 7, he must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace. If an unbeliever knows this person's a lousy guy in the community, and he's a leader of that church, what are they going to think about that church? What are they going to think about Jesus? He needs to have a good reputation with outsiders. Or else he could fall into the devil's trap. When we become accountable to greater responsibility and greater authority in Jesus' church, we get a bigger target on our back from Satan. We need to pray for our elders. So this idea of elders here, to wrap it up, is it an office or is it just an old guy that's hanging around and we look to him as leader? I think it is an office. The ESV even uses the word office, even though the word office is not there in the Greek, but because it's something that is aspired to. There's a lot of people that if they just don't die, they get old, but that's not an aspiration. This idea of elder is something that can be aspired to. That's why it is an office. They need to have the focus is on character and the focus is on capability. And if you have to have one over the other, character wins. Character is the top priority. Capability is a secondary priority, but both of them are important. Should we approach this list as a checklist of qualifications, or should we see it more as a list of the kind of qualities of the kind of character that you want and the kind of guys who are your leaders? And I don't think that Jesus died to give us a new law. I don't think we should approach this as a legal checklist, but it can be useful to hold this up to help and encourage our folks. If I were to go back to that list, is there any quality of that any mature Christian shouldn't have? It's really just a list of saying this is what a mature Christian looks like. And whether you become an elder or not in your life, if God never calls you to be an elder, fine. It's a list of what a mature believer should look like. Every one of us should aspire to those qualities. So here's a list of how not to appoint an elder. And I've seen many of these. I've seen bad examples of many of these. I've been in a church where there was an elder just because he was really old. It was a really small church and he was the oldest guy. So how can the oldest guy not be an elder? The good news is he made sure that the meetings didn't go past 6 p.m. because he was already asleep. Don't make a guy an elder because he's wealthy. There's a lot of danger and lack of wisdom in that. Just because he runs a good business. Now, there might be some elders that do run good businesses. There might be elders who run bad businesses, but just because he runs a good business does not by itself make him qualified. Just because he's popular. What if he's a local celebrity? What if he's on TV? Wouldn't we want him to be the face of our church? No, that's not a qualification. What if, he's trying to control everything anyway, so maybe we should just give him the controls and bring him on the elder. No, being controlling is not qualifications. Another one at the top of the list, I've seen this one, because no one else will. Sometimes churches were short-sighted when they wrote out their bylaws and they say, we must have 5 elders at minimum. And they have 4 really good qualified guys. And then there's Joe, because he's willing to come to the meetings. He's not qualified in 8 different ways, but no one else will. So we'll bring him in so that we can meet the bylaws. That means your bylaws are broken. That's what that means. We better make him an elder because he might leave the church if we don't. That's not a good reason. That's called codependency. He's just a really nice guy. There's a lot of great, nice guys that don't have what it takes to serve as an elder. And he just needs to get more involved. That's, he's not ready to leave the church yet, but he's just kind of being lazy and we want to challenge him this. No, this is something that he would want to step up to. So practical roles, the essentials, we're looking for guys who are actively shepherding, actively teaching in some kind of capacity. It might be in a classroom, but it might be one-on-one. Actively being an example. If someone says, what does a mature believer look like around here? They should be the people you can point to and say, looks kind of like that. He's not perfect, but looks kind of like that. And being able to handle church discipline. If something goes wrong and we have to protect the boundaries, does he have a backbone and a moral high ground to be able to stand up and guard those boundaries? So the non-essentials, there's a lot of non-essentials. And sadly, in practice, we often make non-essentials to be essential. Here's an example. I served at one church where there was a guy who was shepherding more than anybody else on the elder team. He was teaching more than anybody else on the elder team. He was an example. 3 of his kids had graduated Bible colleges, were in ministry. He was a great example. And he ran the Celebrate Recovery group. You think that involves a little bit of discipline? But you know what? He would turn a 2-hour meeting into a 5-hour meeting. So he wasn't an elder. I missed that. I missed the scripture where it says you're bad at meetings, so you can't be an elder. And sometimes we take non-essentials and we turn them into essentials for practical purposes, and we get away from scripture when we do that. False elders in contrast to overseers. So I know we're out of time here. So just to look really closely, I'll just put up this whole list here and you can fill in your blanks. If you look at the false teachers in 1 Timothy, these false teachers, they were failing in 5 areas. They had abandoned the faith, and you can see between 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, ways that false teachers abandon the faith. They had a lack of moral integrity, and you can look across 1 Timothy and Titus to see that lack of moral integrity. They had a love for money. They're using their authority to get them more money to make themselves rich. They have minimized the importance of family. Sometimes they are taking advantage of vulnerable women. Sometimes they are forbidding marriage in 1 Timothy 4:3. And they like to produce controversies. They like to stir up quarrels. those are parts that get people disqualified for eldership, and that's what makes someone a false teacher. But if you look on the back of the handout, you'll see there are five major categories of qualities. This is what I tell my students to look for, and to think about what a mature believer looks like in five big qualities. The five qualities are: they have individual morality, they have a Christ-like character. Character is who you are when no one's looking. They are financial example. They are good stewards, but they know that money is a tool and they do not serve money as an idol. They're good examples when it comes to family and sexuality. That doesn't mean that they have to be married, that they have to have kids, but when it comes to family, when it comes to sexuality, they're positive examples in those relationships. And that they have relational skills. They bring peace to a room. They don't like, okay, here comes Elder Joe, and now someone's going to get offended. That's not a good quality, right? An elder needs to be able to bring relational peace, and it needs to have some abilities to teach and lead. And if we look at the disqualifications, the reverse of each of those, the opposite of individual morality is being ungodly. The opposite of that financial maturity is being motivated by money as an idol. The opposite of healthy family and healthy sexuality in the First Timothy passage, it talked about forbidding marriage and having impure relationships and taking advantage of women. Causing quarrels is the opposite of having positive relational skills, and teaching what is false and being manipulative as opposed to good teaching and leading as the ecclesiastical abilities. So here we go. In conclusion, we're going to wrap it all up here. The situation of the false teachers and the vacuum of elders has a lot to do with why Paul gives the qualities that he gives to this church in Ephesus. They had false teachers in that church. Paul and Timothy had kicked the false teachers out of their roles as elders. And now we have a hole, a vacuum, and we have to fill it back in with good leaders. That shapes a lot of why the book is written the way that it is, of why the qualities that are listed are listed in this way. Secondly, the categories of qualifications, they point to some universal applications of the categories. Those five categories that we just listed in the last couple of slides, that transcends all culture, all language, every generation of every time and every place. Those five qualities, they'll transcend, they're universal. And then finally, second to last, next point here, very few people meet the qualifications for eldership, and that's okay. 95% of men in the church probably aren't qualified to be elders, and that's okay. There's lots of other good areas where we need people serving even outside of eldership. And then finally, every believer should aspire to the qualities of eldership, because the qualities of eldership are the qualities of a mature believer in Christ. And we should all aspire to that, whether we end up serving in eldership or not. All right. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions, you're welcome to stick around and we can chat.